The year is September 12th, 1962. The Cold War was in full heat as the Soviet Union and the United States of America butted heads across the globe. One proxy war in Korea had just ended and another was beginning in Vietnam. Communist China was now aligning itself with the Soviets, causing even more fear of annihilation for an already frightened American people. And it was on this day that President John F. Kennedy uttered 7 immortal words, setting forth a chain of events that would ultimately culminate in perhaps the single greatest source of pride for the American people in its 300-year history.
We choose to go to the moon.
October 4th, 1957, a day that will live in history forever. The Soviets shocked the world by launching the first satellite into orbit. Sputnik 1, which is Russian for satellite, was designed to do little more than transmit a series of beeping noises. However, Sputnik sent a clear message to the world that the Soviets were now the leaders in technology. More importantly than that, though, it struck fear into the hearts of the American people. Rampant speculations followed the Russians' announcement, saying that it could be used to launch missiles from space or spy on the Americans. While this was far from the truth, it sent America into a state of panic as it tried to catch up to the Soviets, who had all of a sudden gained a huge lead. They would need to do something drastic and unimaginable if they were to top this display of technological advancement. But they first needed to assemble a team to do it.
The Russians had already put together a crack team of scientists, headed by Ukrainian Sergei Korolev, a genius engineer they had recently released from prison. So genius that he would later be called the father of practical aeronautics. It would take a near-perfect group of people to be able to outwit him, especially after the Soviets had a sizable lead. The Americans would need help from outside, help from someplace far away, help from aliens of a sort. German immigrant and rocket scientist Wernher von Braun had recently relocated to America, fleeing the Nazis after they had forced him to create their V-2 rockets during World War II. Wernher von Braun and the other German rocket scientists used their knowledge of rocketry they had gained during the course of the war to make gains on the Russians. However, as this interview with Korolev will demonstrate, the Soviets were not afraid.
So, Sergey, what are your opinions on the American space program now?
In terms of like progress, I mean, obviously we are ahead of them. I think their space program is honestly kind of a joke. They aren't gaining much ground.
So what are your opinions of the Soviet space program now that Stalin has passed away?
Stalin, he definitely did some good things, but he wasn't an asset. We definitely can move forward without him, and I don't think it'll be a problem. I do not question our ability to progress and to beat America.
The American government wasted no time starting their work. President Eisenhower passed the National Defense Education Act to promote science and technology in American schools and universities to try to get an equal footing with Russia in the years to come, a move that proved hugely successful. He also established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, in 1958, and von Braun got busy. Von Braun was now the inheritor of a program called Project Mercury from the Air Force, which was designed to get a man into space. The scientists were hopeful, but most observers had little faith that the Americans would be able to get a man into space before the Russians due to the large amount of time needed to prepare for the first Mercury launch. They were correct in their doubts. Once again, the world watched the Russians in awe as they sent the first man into space. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin, dubbed a cosmonaut, orbited the Earth for 108 minutes before landing safely again in Russia. The world was astounded.
But the Americans weren't giving up without a fight. Just 3 weeks later, on May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American to enter space. Though he did not successfully orbit the Earth, he was the first human to take manual control of a spacecraft in space, another major milestone. This did not stop President John F. Kennedy from sensing the embarrassment that the American people felt being second, and he knew that failure was no longer an option. They needed a goal and a plan. Kennedy consulted Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson and scientists from various universities and backgrounds before setting America on a path to achieving the impossible. On September 12, 1962, he told the world what he had decided.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills.
Kennedy had just handed von Braun and his team an impossible task. The difficulties of getting to the moon are far too numerous to list, and not only did they need to overcome all of them, but they needed to do it before the end of the decade if they were to keep Kennedy's promise, assuming the Russians didn't get there first. While Korolev never officially answered the question if the Russians were also pursuing a moon landing, later historical records show that they were in fact racing against the Americans, and most of the public believed that the Russians were trying to beat the Americans to the moon. Nevertheless, NASA founded the Apollo program and began planning a series of missions to eventually get an American to the moon and back. They decided to first use a series of launches that they named Project Gemini to test the feasibility of getting to the moon and performing extravehicular activities in space, or EVA. These two-man rockets also helped test designs that would later be used to create three-man rockets using the Apollo mission. However, Gemini rockets took almost a year longer than anticipated to launch, and while they were prepping to begin the journey that Kennedy had laid out for them, he was suddenly assassinated. As America mourned the man which had given them the confidence to beat the Russians surged ahead and were able to achieve another first when they launched their Voskhod 1 rocket in 1964. This was the first space flight to be performed while not wearing a spacesuit. Though initially delayed, all the other Gemini flights were more or less on time and successful as the project came to a close with Gemini 12 in 1966. By the end of the project, the Americans were actually ahead of the Russians due to a 2-year hiatus the Russians took after Voskhod 1, and it also created an experienced pool of astronauts to choose from during later Apollo missions. On the Russian side of the race, the situation was now far more dire. Sergei Korolev, the leader of the Soviet space program, had died from heart complications caused by the physical hardships he had experienced during his time in a gulag. The Russians had now begun to realize just how much they relied on Sergei's brilliance. Meanwhile, everything was in place to begin the Apollo missions, and for the first time in the space race, it looked as if the Americans might have the upper hand.
Everyone at the Cape Canaveral launch site was preparing for the first launch of the Apollo missions on January 27, 1967. A generally uneventful day, the most interesting events were a series of rehearsal countdowns to take place that afternoon. Minor communication problems and another problem with a smell emitting from the ship that smelt of sour buttermilk delayed the countdown until after that evening. Then suddenly, as the crew was running through the launch checklist in the cabin, a small spark from the environment control area of the ship was recorded. Then all hell broke loose. A fire was started in the cabin, filled by the oxygen-rich environment that allowed the cabin to reach temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Celsius, killing all 3 of the crew members almost instantly. From the time the fire was first noticed to the time it killed them, only 15 seconds had passed. They were still communicating to Mission Control during the incident, and this tape was recorded of their last moments. This tape caused an investigation of NASA to be called for by Congress and the safety features of the rockets to be reevaluated. It was determined by the investigation that the fire was started by a small wire that had been stripped of its Teflon casing, but equally to blame for it was the inadequate safety features of the cabin, particularly the multi-latch door that the crew members were unable to open due to the high pressures that the fire created. The congressional investigation showed that NASA was not at fault and could continue with the Apollo missions, provided of course that those issues were addressed. President Johnson had anticipated that the release of the Apollo 1 tapes would cause a loss of support for the space program, but in reality it did the opposite. Determined not to let the sacrifices of the Apollo 1 crew members be in vain, support for the space program surged as people searched for retribution.
Von Braun and his team wasted no time redesigning the command module, and soon Apollo 4 was ready for launch. An unmanned launch of the Saturn V rocket, which was powered by a revolutionary new booster of Von Braun's design. The launch was virtually flawless, which gave a level of confidence to Von Braun going into the next launch, Apollo 6. Apollo 6 was also an unmanned test flight of the Saturn V rocket, this time with an even more powerful booster attached, and the lunar module docked. 2 minutes into the launch, 2 engines failed due to a phenomenon called pogo oscillation, caused by the massive amounts of power being produced by the engines. However, the rocket was able to overcome the loss of thrust and limp into orbit, barely. Apollo 6 was listed officially as a partial failure, and Von Braun was again forced back to the drawing board in order to fix his engines. But there was little time remaining. CIA reports had come in showing pictures of a Saturn V-sized rocket on a Russian launch pad, indicating that they too were close to landing on the moon. Though in actuality the Russians were floundering about, lost without the genius of their hero Korolev, the Americans were feeling the pressure. Von Braun elected to skip another unmanned launch and go ahead with Apollo 8, a manned mission to orbit the moon using Von Braun's redesigned Saturn V. Von Braun and the Americans believed that the first faction to orbit the moon would win the space race, so he hurriedly launched the Apollo 8 mission. Four days later, after losing contact with mission control as they passed across the far side of the moon, the astronauts aboard Apollo 8 witnessed the first ever Earthrise. The sight of it brought many to tears, both aboard the ship and on the ground. Everything was in place now to do what people mere years before thought to be impossible: land on the surface of the moon.
Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and Neil Armstrong. These are the names that the American government selected to be the first humans to ever set foot on the moon. On July 16, 1969, over 1 million people arrived to see them off in person, and over 500 million watched on their television with bated breath. At exactly 1:32 in the afternoon, they set off on their 8-day journey to the moon and back without a hitch. 3 days later, they arrived. The lunar module capsule detached with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong aboard. They began to search the Sea of Tranquility for a place to set the craft down. They had difficulty finding a safe spot and came within 15 seconds of running out of fuel, but finally, after an hour of searching, Armstrong put a nervous ground control at ease by informing them that the Eagle has landed. Cheers were heard all across the world in both Russia and America, and soon Neil Armstrong was ready to exit the module and plant the American flag on the surface of the moon. As he took his first steps, he spoke the words that would ring across history forever.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own.
This event has oftentimes been considered the most significant thing that the United States has ever done, and even 40 years later, those who witnessed it still remember it.
I was about 6 years old at the time, and I had already gone to bed because I believe it was a weeknight. Even if it wasn't, I was already in bed. And my parents woke me up. I believe it was late at night. And even though we had a color TV, we all crowded around and it was just in black and white and it was kind of fuzzy. But I remember my parents waking me up because they felt that it was such an important event that we all needed to experience it together. So I'll never forget.
The space race caused a huge increase in the scientific knowledge and industrial power of both countries. But ultimately, its greatest contribution to both countries was the spirit of patriotism, cooperation, and perseverance that manifested itself in the hearts and minds of the people. Mankind as a race has proven that they can do what was thought to be impossible if they just believed they could. It left a lasting legacy of an emphasis on the importance of science in both countries, and both nations continue to be leaders in science and technology to this day. However, it also increased tensions between both superpowers that would affect the relations up until the Cold Wars ended in 1991, and also caused the Soviet Union to spend itself into a great deficit, furthering their demise. But perhaps the greatest impact that the space race has had on people is the inspiration that those 3 brave astronauts gave to all people of Earth. That they did that which was not possible to do, and they did so for the advancement of all mankind, not just one nation. They truly came in peace.